the latest era that we're in, we haven't really surpassed 300 parts per million. So we're in those unprecedented territories. The sources of those greenhouse gas emissions, this is just for the U.S. It differs if you look globally. Transportation is a little bit less, and industry is a bit more. Agriculture can be a bit more. But for the U.S., this is kind of what we're seeing here. About 30% of the CO2 emissions are related to transportation. Electricity and industry make up about half. Agriculture, 10%. We can quibble about that. It depends on how you count deforestation and livestock management and things like that. But that's kind of where we're at right now. The main thing here is that even though it's global warming, the increase in global average temperature, which I'll show in a second, the largest contributions historically have been from North America and from Europe. Now, if you look at today's numbers, as in the last year or 10 years, East Asia has contributed the largest amount, but it's a bit unfair. We need to really look at historical cumulative net anthropogenic CO2 emissions to know that it is really the Western world that really has the largest contribution. As I'll talk about in a little bit, unfortunately, at the same time, the impacts disproportionately fall on those that have contributed the least to climate change. Now, that holds globally, but it also holds right here in Illinois, right here in Champaign-Urbana as well. Here's global warming. Oh, my GIF didn't work. Well, these are 5 different curves showing the increase in global average temperature. That's global warming. Global warming doesn't really have any impacts necessarily. What it does is it changes regional climates, changes the way that the air flows, changes the way the oceans flow, changes the way everything interacts, changes how much ice we have. And that influences our regional climates. And because our systems, whether it be our human systems, our ecological systems, all things tied together are so sensitive, even relatively small changes in our climate can create huge impacts, as we've seen just in the last few months or so. So this is global warming. We're going to talk about climate change. Now, importantly, when I talk about the impacts of climate change, it's important to realize I'm over here in this circle. I can't see the green laser pointer on this screen. So I'm over here in this on the left-hand circle with the hazards. Basically, what I do as a climate scientist is a lot of my work is studying the hazards. How much are heat waves changing? How much are intense precipitation changing? How much are derechos may or may not be changing? Those sorts of things. But of course, that's only one part of the risk. The other part is vulnerability, which is extremely important when it comes to climate change. In fact, I'd argue that climate change doesn't create as many problems as it just exacerbates already existing problems, problems with vulnerability. I used this example the other day when I was talking about, people say, oh, tornadoes just seem to find mobile home parks. That's not true. Tornadoes occur randomly. It's the vulnerabilities in the mobile home park. So when one finds one, there's problems, right? And so that's the same thing here. So when we think about hazards, that's fine and all. We talk about more heat waves, more intense rainfall, but the vulnerability is there, and it's exacerbated by that changing hazard. Now, that's good news, bad news here. The bad news is that without fixing climate change, these vulnerabilities that already exist in our society are going to get worse, as are the disproportionate impacts. The good news is that the solutions already exist to fix these inequities, these vulnerabilities. We just have to have the political will to enact them. And I'll get to that in a little bit towards the end when I talk about solutions. Here's climate change in a nutshell for Illinois. It's gotten warmer, it's gotten wetter over the last 150 years. When we break it out by season, winter is warmed at the fastest rate. Our nights are warming faster than our days in every single season. That's really important for human health risk, as well as agriculture and ecological impacts, things like that. And we've gotten wetter, and about 5 inches wetter here in central Illinois than we were maybe 150 years ago, which would be fine, except that it's coming in larger batches where we're getting more intense rainfall. And paradoxically, it actually puts us at a higher risk of drought. And I'll talk about that in a second. So here's I'll talk literally a second. Here's the water problems, right? I'm framing it like this. Globally, what we've seen is an invigorated hydrologic cycle, meaning that when we think about the hydrologic, I always go back to the Magic School Bus episode on the hydrologic cycle. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that before. It's like my favorite episode. My son is less enthused about it than I am anymore, but we have the evaporation, then we have the condensation, precipitation, runoff, maybe infiltration or percolation down to the groundwater, or maybe re-evaporation or transpiration with the plants. All of that, we have surface water movement. All of that is being invigorated. More evaporation, more precipitation, or at least more intense precipitation, perhaps more runoff. And so all of these things, stream flow being invigorated by climate change globally, but also here in Illinois. Now, what that does is things that we sort of are familiar with here in Illinois. Anybody want to tell me where that top left photo is from? Nobody? Oh, it's okay. Yeah, there it is, Gibson City. Yep. Yeah, I was in 2021. It runs together now because we've had so many of these types of events. Yeah, this is what we've seen. And actually, most of this flooding is out. I say this with Sally sitting right here. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say most of this flooding is outside the mapped floodplains. Thank you. What it is, and we've seen this. We saw this on the west side of Chicago this year, and we saw it in Belleville last year. We see it in Champaign every time we get 2 inches of rain. The ribeye floods every single time. It's not a problem of development in the floodplains in Illinois as much as it was 30 years ago. The problem now is antiquated stormwater drainage systems that just can't handle the intense precipitation that we get anymore, right? My predecessors at the Water Survey estimated the storm duration, right, the return interval of whatever storms are coming. And between 1989 and 2019, what they found is that for Northeast Illinois, that 100-year, 24-hour storm jumped by an inch. So all of these engineers are building their subdivisions and their drainage management infrastructure to a certain code. And now 30 years after that code was written, we say, oh, nope, it's up by an inch. So already antiquated infrastructure is even that much more out of date. And the question really is can we economically feasibly keep up with these changes? Right now here at the Water Survey, what we're doing is a projected analysis of storm duration to look at, I don't want to use to future change of what the storms are going to look like in 2050 to say, if you're going to build this subdivision, hopefully it's got a lifetime more than 30 years. These are the storms they're going to be dealing with. And it's a real problem because a lot of these folks, because they're not in a floodplain, didn't know they were at risk of flooding. And mapping and modeling these kind of precipitation events is really, really hard. And beyond that, for agriculture, of course, as this group knows very well, when you get really intense rainfall, you get runoff, and that carries with it nutrients and it carries with it soil. So you have all sorts of problems with that when you're running off of agricultural fields into public waterways or maybe municipal drinking water resources. And then you add to that the challenging part of population growth. The part of the bottom left there is CMAP's projection for the Chicagoland area. And this is really without any sort of climate migration, which is really uncertain. And so, we add on top of that the increased demand from these water resources and the increase of the number of people who are possibly in the way of these types of hazards. It's really problematic. And then, as I kind of hinted to earlier, paradoxically, this increase in rainfall intensity actually puts us at a higher risk of drought, because all of this water here, most of this water here in Gibson City, certainly this water here off this ag field in Champaign County, that's running off. It's into the Sangamon, it's down the Illinois, it's down to the Gulf, it's gone. And what that means is that water is not where we want it, which is in the ground, in the soil. And so if we get the same amount of rain, even more rain, but it falls more intensely, it could actually mean that we're getting less return of that rain into the soil. So it puts us at a higher risk of agricultural drought. We've seen that almost every year now, where places like in parts of Southern Illinois are getting inundated for a week or two, and then they go for 30, 60 days without any rain at all. It's just flip-flop between drought and inundation. And it really just hydrologically doesn't really help. So that's the water problem. Lots of water, the heat problem here. Sorry, I'm introducing problems, then I'll talk about solutions. The heat problems here. Heat, of course, is the biggest. I would say that overall, I've been asked this a couple of times, like, what do you lose sleep over with climate change, that sort of thing? Not a ton, because I always sleep well, but that's just me. But the thing that I'm most concerned with is heat, because the projections are the most consistent, the historical trends are most consistent, that we are increasing the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of heat waves. And when we add to that those population dynamics, it means that more people are at exposure to extreme heat. This chart here on the top left is showing the projected change in very warm nights, where nights don't get above 70 degrees. Don't get below 70 degrees in Illinois. You can see that consistent increase projected by 2050 under a moderate emission scenario, meaning we actually start to curb CO2 emissions by 2050. We're still looking at an additional 15 to 30 nights where we're not getting below 70 degrees. And really that 70-degree mark is a good indication of, can I open my windows at night or not? Is it just too sticky? And that nighttime is really when we get that recovery from extreme heat. So when we get hot day, warm night, that's when we begin to see the excess mortality, morbidity, and public health impacts begin to stack up.
Does that impact the dew point then as well?
The dew point is really driving this. Yeah. So the humidity is really the big driver of that. Yeah, really important point there. And that's the thing, is if it's not getting below 70 degrees, chances are your dew point's at 70 or 72, it's humid. it's humid. So, or not 70, it's near 70. So it's extremely humid. And that's another problem too. It's adding to that, exacerbating that problem. But as I mentioned before, it's not just the exposure, it's the vulnerability. So I always pick on Chicago. I heard that there's this thing about like every map of Chicago is the same map of Chicago when you're mapping exposure to hazards or vulnerability. We all know what parts of the city are most at risk. You can just see it, even if you don't know the city real well when you're driving through it. So I'm going to pick on Champaign instead. Well, you can see here on the right-hand side, this is the heat vulnerability by census tract map. I have the URL up there. I need to get with the times and put one of those QR codes, but this is the URL there. And it's a neat thing put on by NOAA. It's a heat vulnerability mapper. And what it's showing is that when you cross the tracks, you're just driving down Prospect, when you literally, it's sort of like a cliche. When you cross the tracks, you go from an area to the north, a census tract that's in the top 25%, top 15% of heat vulnerability. So that's not the exposure, it's just the vulnerability. You cross over moving south towards downtown, you're crossing into an area that's in the bottom 20% in vulnerability. So just crossing over that area, moving into, and when you think about it, if we have a heat wave in Champaign, it's not actually any hotter up here than it is down here. That's not how heat waves work on that small of scale. It's all about the vulnerability. So when we have increased heat waves, it's not folks here or here or here or West Champaign or Muhammad or Monticello that are hurting the most. It's where the vulnerability is. And so when I talk about fixing climate change, it's not just about fixing the fact that we're going to get more heat waves if we don't stop emitting carbon dioxide. It's also a matter of fixing the inherent vulnerability, the inherent disproportionate sort of availability of resources in our society. And so that's a really important piece just to point out. And I think heat really makes those distinctions the clearest. And then we have flora and fauna problems. Let me raise this up for just a second because I think I knocked it down. I'm good. I'm okay. I will make sure it's Zoom okay. I'm on Zoom. Good. Okay. Hello, Zoom people. So the flora and fauna problems, we have these multifaceted threats. All right. So when it comes to things like flora and fauna, it's not just extreme weather, as we could think of disturbances, increased heat, perhaps drought, flash drought, and those sorts of things. But we also have the fact that our climate is warming and wetting, means that it's making a more conducive environment for certain types of non-native or invasive species of perhaps insect pests and possible competitors for weeds, essentially, right? So we have these compound effects of, yes, we're getting more extreme weather that's affecting trees, for example, but we also have different types of bugs like emerald ash borer, different types of diseases, the fungal diseases that decimate crops often. And then we have the competitors, the weeds, the Japanese stokegrass and the Amur honeysuckle and things like that. And so all of these types, I use, of course, examples that we have. Of course, we're all familiar with the Kopi, and then we talked about runoff from agricultural fields having issues with water quality as well. All of these things sort of add up for a really complex interaction with flora and fauna. So there's a lot of work, really good work being done at the Natural History Survey and elsewhere, trying to understand how climate change actually does impact or is going to impact lots of these different lots of really important, both economically and culturally, species and plants and animals here in Illinois. Amanda reminded me, and this is a really good hint, that we don't live in a bubble. In fact, the kind of thing that I've laid out here for Illinois is actually relatively rosy when you compare to the global kind of outlook. What this map is showing is you can kind of see the outline of the world there, these different regions. This is an observed change from the IPCC, observed change in agriculture, ecological drought. And what you see is that some of the most politically contentious and least resource available parts of the world are also having more droughts. So it's not just that everybody's getting more droughts and the vulnerability is highest in sub-Saharan Africa. No, the vulnerability is highest in sub-Saharan Africa, and they're getting more droughts compared to places with more resources like Northern Europe and North America. When we add to this the impact of sea ice and glacier loss, and the effects that has on drinking water for millions of people around the world, especially in Central Asia. And then probably the biggest impact, I would say, globally is sea level rise. This is the biggest impact because it is going to displace many, many people and cause many confrontations and problems around the world. And just here in the U.S., we're going to have to deal with the fact that parts of South Beach and much of New Orleans is going to be ephemerally underwater in 50 years. So what that looks like and what money is going to where is going to be big decisions being made. Now, we can sit here up in Illinois and be like, well, you shouldn't have moved there. But of course, that's not really all that helpful. Sometimes I feel that way with Florida, but it's not helpful. And the nice thing about sea level rise is that it's actually far more predictable, easy to predict than it moves more slowly, and it's far more predictable than say changes in extreme heat or precipitation. Okay. That was a really rosy picture of climate change, right? And sometimes I've given talks and I've just ended there, and then everybody comes up like, man, what are we going to do? Okay, I need to talk about solutions. We can build climate resilience. We separate mitigation and adaptation a lot, but in fact, they work together. So there's lots of solutions up here. Some of them fall in mitigation, like decarbonizing the economy, renewable energy, energy conservation, and some fall more under adaptation, like disaster management, emergency preparation, flood protection, infrastructure upgrades. And then there's some in the middle, like developing local food. It provides mitigation, adaptation, urban forest or green space development, both mitigation and adaptation. These are really important. And by the way, Amanda's got access to the slides. She can share them widely too if people are taking pictures of them. Globally, what the mitigation really requires is a decrease in carbon dioxide emissions. That we're not going to fix the problem. We can adapt all we want. We're not going to fix the problem until we get a handle on carbon dioxide emissions. We really got to go net zero by 2050. That's the goal, to really keep the kind of worst impacts of climate change from happening. And that requires an immediate substantial curbing of emissions and renewable clean energy, transportation. It's a requirement. It's an absolute requirement, and it's globally. But I hate the question of, well, what if we do all this and China doesn't? And what if we have this wonderful renewable energy economy and China doesn't? Well, okay, it's good for us. National scale solutions, transportation is extremely important. But when we think about solutions for mitigation, it's not just about everybody drive an EV. Ideally, it's a switch, especially in high populated areas, of people not driving cars and having access to walkable cities, bikeable cities, and public transit. So we have to talk about that energy efficiency. Now, that's not going to be for everybody, but that combined with the scaling up of electric vehicles is one way to make a big dent in transportation. For agriculture, number one problem in agriculture is food waste. That's just, we're going to get that out of the way. Food waste is the easiest thing to solve, and that's a huge problem in agriculture. Beyond that, the production of agriculture, what land we use for what crops, and how we raise livestock in the US and globally are a big problem to solve. We can talk about diets as well. I have that on there for sort of these personal solutions. But food waste is something that no matter who's in the room, we say nobody wants to waste food, and yet we're still wasting about 30% of the food grown in the US, to give or take. Oh, and then industry, I can't forget about them. Low carbon fuels. This is from DOE, and energy efficiency in industry are really important as well. Okay, last couple of things here. Adaptation and resilience locally. So that's kind of, I talk about global solutions, right? I mean, but none of us are going to redesign Champaign-Urbana to have great public transit. So more locally, planning and development, food systems, natural resources, and then of course a just transition. All of these things are extremely important when we're talking about solutions. And again, these are pretty diverse things. Talk about updated flood risk maps, right? That's really important. Just understanding who's at risk, and so that people can take the action that they need. That's a really important part of adaptation. Safe and affordable housing. It's amazing how many problems get solved when people have safe and affordable housing. Not just without climate change, but setting aside climate change, so many problems get solved. Climate change is another one. Gosh, how many people get told to silence their phones during talks? Food systems, sustainable agriculture, and then natural resources, things like floodplain connection, brownfield development. These are all parts of really important adaptation locally. Climate resilient design. I'm going to skip past this slide a little bit because I'm already probably past my time. But these climate resilient designs, when we're talking about using nature-based solutions, is often the key. One important thing about nature-based solutions is that these conversations are being had with engineers, but we need to bring in ecologists because nature is itself very sensitive to climate change. So the engineering solution is just plant a tree, and then the ecologists pull their hair out and say, no, not that tree. So that's a really important thing. I hear a lot from my ecologist friends. And then individual action. Number one thing you can do as an individual is community engagement, political activism. That's by far the number one thing. above everything else. And that can mean lots of different things. It can mean what you're doing right now, or support for local groups who are making a difference in climate. It can be running for local office. I know there are many arcane zoning laws on the books in towns all across Illinois. I know about one in particular that was actually removed by a certain suburb in the Chicagoland area about development, how large the development has to be before you clear cut. Those kind of things matter, and they're the easiest things to fix too. We don't have to go to Congress, right? You just run for local office. But also engaging friends, family. I talk about wasteful consumption, food waste, fast fashion, planned obsolescence, non-reusable plastics, HVAC overuse. All of these things are things that can be done really, honestly, quite easily, right? I'm preaching to the choir. I know that you're here. I know, but one big thing that you all can do because you buy into this is engaging the friends and family. And then, of course, climate conscious diets and energy and conservation. So my contact information is there. Again, I'll be here for Q&A, but again, thank you very much for letting me talk today. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks to Trent. So I have just about 10-15 minutes to talk with you all about Prairie Rivers Network and the work we're doing, state and federal policies that have been passed to do some of that climate adaptation and mitigation that we heard Trent talk about. And I think you'll see through the course of my presentation, when I talk about Prairie Rivers Network, that includes all of you in this room. I see some people in the room who I've got pictures of. So just think about this as work that we're all doing together and need to continue to do together. So I didn't introduce myself. Amanda Panca. I'm the Director of Energy and Community Resiliency at Prairie Rivers Network. So let's dive right in. And here's one of those pictures where I see Jack and Sharon and Lois and Alice in this Zoom lobby day, along with our late friend and Senator Scott Bennett, who was a CEJA champion. So in September of 2021, we passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And this is really, you hear it called nation leading comprehensive clean energy and climate legislation. And that's really what it is. So it does a lot of things to tackle climate change and build a new clean energy economy. Carbon-free power means that CEJA gives us shutdown dates for coal and gas plants in the state of Illinois. Some of those aren't as near term as we would like the Prairie State coal plant, and we're working on that. And CEJA also, as we're closing these coal plants, we have communities that are hard hit by loss of tax revenue, loss of jobs. It includes programs and grants to support coal and fossil fuel communities. We're closing coal plants. We need to build out renewable energy. CEJA has all sorts of incentives, programs to build wind, solar, and to make sure we're doing that in communities that need it the most, that can benefit the most from it. Along with renewable energy, energy efficiency, better to not use the energy at all. So CEJA has goals to actually have energy savings. And our utilities, Ameren and ComEd, are in charge of those energy efficiency programs. A lot of us downstate are with Ameren. Most of those programs are low income, but if you know folks in your community that could benefit from insulation, smart thermostats, spread the word. There are programs to help us utilize those through CEJA. CEJA is going to build 13 workforce hubs across the state of Illinois to train people up in all of these new sectors in renewable energy, clean energy, electric vehicles. So speaking of electric vehicles, CEJA has a few pieces that deal with that. We have a new rebate program in Illinois. And then we'll also have a incentive programming for charging infrastructure for communities that's not up and running yet. And then finally, CEJA has some utility accountability measures. So we're ensuring that as our utilities are building out all this new infrastructure, they're doing it in a way that's best for the consumer, not best for the utility's pocketbook. So in addition to state legislation, I'm going to talk about just broad overview of two federal laws that are climate action laws in Illinois, despite their lame names. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, does a lot of stuff for infrastructure, from broadband to roads to water, but it has a lot of climate opportunities as well. mostly in the way of building clean energy through demonstration projects, grid modernization, and investing in American manufacturing of a lot of these new technologies. It also has some electric vehicle incentives, including a clean school bus program, which you maybe have heard Prairie Rivers Network talk a lot about. And we've had some local schools win the rebates for that program. So that's exciting. It also includes a lot of money for cleaning up legacy pollution. And I'll talk a little bit more about the work Prairie Rivers Network is doing on that. And finally, it does include a lot of funding to improve infrastructure. So we heard Trent talk about the need for improvements in water infrastructure to deal with climate. So it includes funding for things like that as well. And then another piece of federal legislation that doesn't sound like a climate bill, but is actually the biggest piece of climate legislation in US history, and that's the Inflation Reduction Act. And it makes $369 billion available in funding to tackle climate change. The dominant strategy that I'm going to call it the IRA, that the IRA employs is tax credits for both homeowners and businesses to build out clean energy and clean energy manufacturing. And actually, I have one of the handouts today is a list of some of the tax credits that folks can take advantage of. And we're going to launch a blog post this week that's going to give you a couple tools from Department of Energy and a nonprofit called Rewiring America, where you can kind of navigate and see which one of these tax credits makes sense for you and your home. So check that out. The Inflation Reduction Act also has funding for transportation electrification. There's also going to be new rebates for electrifying our homes, becoming more energy efficient. And our state energy offices are going to roll those programs out. So in Illinois, our Illinois Environmental Protection Agency is home to our state energy office. They are, as we speak, developing this new rebate program that's going to be point of sale when you're buying a new induction stove or a more energy efficient appliance. You'll get huge rebates on those. The Inflation Reduction Act also has a whole host of grant and loan programs to bring clean energy to communities across the U.S. There is also a lot of funding for conservation, forestry, and climate smart agriculture, and so much more that we can't go into today, and not all of it's good. So you'll hear us in Prairie Rivers Network messaging talking about a few of the things that, because the fossil fuel industry still has such undue influence in Washington, D.C., there were some compromises made. And one thing I wanted to point out about these three laws is, they're not working in silos, right? So one of the other handouts for today is this blog post that turned fact sheet about Illinois schools have a bright green future. If you read this, it's going to really show you how CEJA, our state law, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, are all working in cohort to help entities like schools have a carbon-free future. So that's pretty exciting, and Illinois is really poised to benefit the most from these federal laws because of what we did with CEJA. So I'm just going to kind of briefly run through kind of some of the ways that Prairie Rivers Network is doing this work. And again, you'll see some folks in the room and pictures here, which is really exciting because you guys are all part of this. So in addition to fighting climate change, we need to ensure we're cleaning up the legacy pollution of the past. Prairie Rivers Network is really the nonprofit organization leading on coal ash, leading on abandoned mine land reclamation. In addition to that legacy pollution cleanup, we're ensuring that we're stopping pollution in current industries and preventing more pollution in the future. So we're doing that a lot of times with Sierra Club, with frontline organizations like Stand Up to Coal, where we're preventing new sources of pollution. We are bringing clean energy and support to communities. And so whether that's talking to community leaders, creating fact sheets, blogs, you'll see me talk about press in a little bit, hosting events and tours. We're even diving in on technical assistance on some of these programs. So a big thing I've done the last year is worked with coal communities to take advantage of these new CEJA grants to help them recover from the loss of a coal plant or a coal mine. And then I'm really excited. You don't see her today, but my new coworker, Nina Struess, is our host on Zoom. So we had about 40 people join Nina on Zoom this morning. And Nina is working in the Quad Cities area. She's the River Health and Resiliency Organizer. And so this is a partnership with the National Wildlife Federation. PRN is the state affiliate. And they're working on a climate vulnerability assessment for the Quad Cities region. So they're looking at what environmental factors could create risks for the Quad Cities, like more frequent floods. They're going to have tools for communities to identify and pursue investments in nature-based projects for reducing risks, helping local economies and wildlife. So one of my hopes in an event like this is always to make connections. And so while Trent was talking, Nina was already texting me saying, I want to get connected with him. So we've already accomplished one of my goals. So I'm going to hook you up with Nina. You'd be a great resource, and hopefully she will be for you as well. So we also ensure that ecosystems are resilient. A changing climate is going to have impacts on our native ecosystems and the species that depend on them. So through Prairie Rivers Network's habitat work and our pesticide work, we're ensuring that these natural communities are expanded and that they're protected so they're more resilient in the face of climate change. So we often hold events like today to share information, to connect you with experts. And one of my goals in these events is always to hear from you. So I'm excited for the question and answer and the discussion section. You know, we always want to hear what challenges are you facing? What do you need to know about to take advantage of these programs, to be advocates with your community leaders? And so we do a lot of that. That's a map of all the Listen, Lead, Share events that the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition hosted to get input to write the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which then passed as the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And Prairie Rivers Network is responsible for a lot of those downstate events. We're really bringing this conversation downstate where a lot of the renewable energy development's being built. Really important for us to be part of the conversation. We tell stories, whether that's through our YouTube page or press. You know, we often tell our members stories. So if you have ideas for inspiration, ways to get the word out, always let us know. We educate our leaders at lobby days in Springfield, DC. We talk with agency leaders, bringing science-based information, ideas for policy, working with them to pass good policy. We take action at climate strikes, lobby days, through action alerts and more. And together with all of you and the public, our voices are stronger. We have more power. And then finally, we inform and write energy and climate policy. So I wish I could tell you today that the state and federal laws that we have are enough to get us where we need to go. We just celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act, and a few studies came out about that time about where is that going to get us in the way of reducing emissions. So the study found that the Inflation Reduction Act, along with state climate bills, will reduce emissions about 29 to 42%. So a big range there by 2030. Our Paris Agreement goals pledge is that we will reduce emissions by 50 to 52%. So we have a ways to go. And this is, you know, both with state and federal action. Prairie Rivers Network works close with the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. I think Andrew leads over half of the working groups and policy committees within the ICJC. And we're working to identify new policy solutions to fix issues in the power sector, to bring renewables on faster, to decarbonize the building sector, the way we heat and cool our homes and businesses, to electrify the transportation sector, and to fight bad policies that might put communities at risk, like lack of regulation and oversight on some carbon capture and storage projects in the state. So I've mentioned it already, but we are a network. I love that part of our name. Much of this has been possible because of our members and folks like you, and we'll need everyone going forward, whether it's getting on a bus to lobby day, writing a letter to the editor. There's one of Nancy's letters to the editor up on the screen there. You can visit our website to get updates, to become a member, to donate. Lots of action alerts on the website and sent out. Most of you are probably on our email list. So take those actions. Does have meaning. So that's all I've got. So I will invite Trent up for Q&A discussion. And we've got folks in the Zoom that will be asking questions too. But I'll go ahead and start in the room. Andy.
Yes, hi. I'm kind of curious about impacts of solar across the state and solar farms, solar community solar fields and things. And I'm just thinking, like, if 60% of our state is corn and soybean now, which is sort of a biomass solar collector for 6 months of the year, if 1% of our land area was solar, that would be 100% of our electricity. Do you see any sort of climatological, downsides or effects from having 1% of our land covered in solar? Something along those lines.
I'm gonna ask if the people on Zoom could hear Andy's question or if I should repeat it. Repeat it. So Andy's asked about Illinois' land is largely in agricultural production. We would need quite a bit of land for solar development. And you've heard about 1% of the land or so. He was kind of directing the question towards Trent on any climatological impacts or issues related to conversion of farmland to solar.
Yeah, it's a good question. Probably not. I mean, there haven't been a lot of studies to focus on what the impact to the weather or on the long-term climate would be on large-scale conversion of land to something like solar. There's been a lot more work on wind and how it affects turbulence and things like that. But for solar, there hasn't been quite as much. One thing that is, if you take that 1% of land and concentrate it, this is all the solar panels we have, then we may see some kind of temperature, micro scale temperature effects. But even in that 1% of land, I wouldn't imagine that would broaden out beyond maybe a county area or anything like that. But more likely, if we do end up getting to that 1% of land, if that's a target or what we need for that, it'll more likely be distributed. So you have a field here, you have a field here, you have a field here, and it's not really going to make that big a difference to the weather and climate. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And you'll see me on my phone because they're giving me the questions from Zoom. So I'm not being weird and rude up here on my cell phone. But let's go ahead and take one more from the room here with Jack, and then we'll take one from Zoom. Go ahead.
Question for the people here. In the land of the converted, how many of you walked, bicycled, took the bus here today?
So Jack has asked folks in the room how many people walked, took public transit, bicycled to the office today for this event. Got 3 people in the room. Thank you. Good round of applause for them. And the people on Zoom stayed home, so you guys get a round of applause too. One of the reasons that it's nice to have events both in person and virtually is folks don't have to get on the road and release emissions on the way. But thanks everybody for being here. Don't stay home for small things like this. All right, so we're going to do a question from Zoom. So Jane Kogi in Carbondale asks Trent if he could elaborate a bit more on the way in which intense rains can then lead to periods of drought.
Yeah. Hi, Jane. Good to hear from you. It all comes down to infiltration in the soil. So if we get a rain, let's say that rain is an inch of rain total. If that falls gently enough, we've all experienced this just watching the ground. If it falls gently enough, the soil can take in a good chunk of that. It depends on how good your soils are, what's covering them, how deep they are, that sort of thing. So up here in Champaign, our soils, generally speaking, can take in a little bit more than in Carbondale, but that's just the case. Now, if you take those same soils and you spread that inch of rain instead of over 24 hours, now it's over an hour or half an hour. The soil may still have the same capacity to take in the same amount of water, but it's not going to, because that very top layer of the soil is going to saturate really quickly, and then it's going to be essentially impermeable. And so what that means is the rest is going to run off. So depending on if you're talking to a hydrologist or someone like me, we call that efficiency, rainfall efficiency or runoff efficiency. But basically, the more intense the rain falls, the more runoff you get. And when that runoff goes into the stream or the stormwater drainage system and out into your local creek and then out into the local river and then the big river and then out into the Gulf, like I mentioned, it's not there for you. And so it's not in the soil. So if you net, let's say, a half an inch in the soil moisture versus a tenth of an inch, what that means is that more intense rain is going to mean actually less soil moisture. And so that's how it puts us at a risk of drought. And we see this in drought monitor, to get into the weeds just a little bit, we see this in our drought monitoring products, where historically we've looked at maps of rainfall over a period of time. And what we're hearing from people on the ground is to say that rain is gone. That fell so quickly that we didn't experience the benefit of that, and we're back in drought. And so I think that's kind of what I mean by that shift to drought overall. Yeah.
Go ahead, Joyce.
Does that also mean that the aquifers, excuse me, are not going to refill as much?
So Joyce has asked how what Trent just described to us might impact aquifer recharge.
It's a really good question. Don't have a lot of good information on how that's going to affect aquifers. And it doesn't mean that it's yes or no. What we're talking about here is more of a topsoil kind of thing, so more of an agriculture ecological drought. There is some concern about demand or withdrawal from groundwater from communities outpacing the being too quick to respond to the slow time that groundwater recharge happens. So that's something we saw in the southwest suburbs, in Joliet right now. There's just too much demand for the supply. And so that is a concern, but that's more dealing with the human aspect more so than the variability of the rainfall. Yeah.
I'm actually going to do another question from Zoom, and I've been instructed to don't need this anymore.
Oh.
Let's put this up. All right, so a very easy question from Zoom is, will the presentation slides be available? And the answer to that is yes. We'll have both Trent's slides and my slides. We'll probably put together like a follow-up blog post where we summarize a lot of the information that Trent shared. We'll link to the recording of the event. So we'll make sure that goes out to all registrants, and then we'll probably go out in our e-news next week also. So that was an easy question. I'm going to do one more from Zoom, and then we'll do another one from the room. So this is from Bob on Zoom. Does Dr. Ford's office follow changes in property insurance rates? Thinking this would be a good proxy for the risk of climate change.
Okay. All right. So no, first of all, I don't follow the change in property insurance rates. However, we are working with people on campus who are insurance experts to better understand the impact that climate change is having on insurance rates. I'm not going to become an insurance expert. That sounds terrible, boring for me, but it is incredibly important. And actually, I sort of joke and not half joke that the insurance industry is driving change faster than any industry, just because you're not getting insurance, and that's kind of driving up the cost of things. So it's a major area to watch across the US, especially, but even here in Illinois, as we see because the insurance industry is watching climate change. They have good data. Whether or not they use that data in appropriate ways is questionable. And what I mean by that is sometimes industry will take leaps of faith with models and projections and things that scientists would kind of shudder at. But what that means is that as scientists, we have to be conversing with insurance industry to make sure they're using the latest and greatest. And so it's ongoing right now. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's do one in the room.
Curious about the effect tillage practices on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I know like no-till with cover crops, you can actually build up carbon in the soil. Yeah, but then you take out a chisel plow and your disc, and all of a sudden you're losing. Is there a big difference there? Is it significant?
Yeah, so the question in the room is about how tillage practices and the way we treat our soil relate to the carbon cycle, and whether we're drawing carbon down and holding it in the soil or releasing it in the atmosphere. And I'll start by saying, I think that 10% of the pie chart that you saw Trent share, it was 10% of carbon emissions come from the agriculture sector. Most of that is from the way we treat our soil, the way we manage our soil. A lot of the other impacts from the agricultural sector, like production of anhydrous ammonia, production of fertilizers, that all falls in the industry slice of the pie. So that 10%, most of that is how we're treating the soil and the carbon cycle, but I'll let you expand.
Yeah, that's what Amanda mentioned is one of the reasons why we say we quibble about agriculture, and that's carbon. That's not methane. When we talk about methane, it's a much larger piece of methane emissions. But for the soil treatment, yes, the amount of the carbon that is released when chisel plowing or strip tilling or things like that it's significant, but that carbon was sequestered over the course of the growing season, or if you have a cover crops. So it is, I mean, that's why it's only 10% and not 80%. I think the main important thing of what you're talking about here, though, is that if we're going to talk about climate smart agriculture, too often that's just focused on cover crops and no-till agriculture without rethinking what we're growing and how we're growing it in the Midwest. And so the important thing is that if there's money, and there is money being pushed into cover crops and no-till for carbon sequestration, the efficacy of that is questionable with research of how much carbon that can actually store. And the main important point is what you mentioned, that you can do that for 10, 20 years. And as soon as you chisel plow, most of it's gone. And so it's not necessarily a net addition to the atmosphere because it was sequestered in the first place, but it's not actually helping despite all the funding being put that way. So cover crops and no-till, from a biodiversity standpoint, from a soil health standpoint, really, really important. From a climate standpoint, it's one tool, but we can't put all our eggs in that basket for ag. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to do another one from Zoom. This is from Annalisa, and it's more kind of a follow-up to Andy's question about taking ag land out of production and if there's any climate changes from having a lot of solar. Annalisa remarks that it seems like some of those climate weather effects could be mitigated if native plants were planted under all the solar fields instead of turf grass. So I wanted to read that just because I think that's a really good point. I've heard from friends in the solar industry that have said there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing native or at least more pollinator friendly vegetation, even under some of these large scale solar farms. So when I talk to farmers or communities who are thinking about larger scale farms, I say, put that on the list of things you want from that solar developer. And so I think that's a really good point. And then a related question on Zoom is from Sandra Lindberg, also Central Illinois. And she, I'm going to try to summarize this. So we've talked a little bit about agricultural practices, and Sandra reflects about the opportunity to actually grow specialty crops underneath solar panels. So this is a word called agrovoltaics, which is co-locating farming practices along with solar, whether that's beekeeping with that pollinator friendly vegetation or grazing sheep, or what Sandra's talking about, actually growing crops between arrays. So she wonders if we see this as something that is potential in the state to grow specialty crops under arrays. And if we can talk about the kind of ag in Illinois and goals surrounding expanding such approaches as this. So I'll say one more thing and then see if Trent has anything to offer. The University of Illinois is actually in a partnership right now with a couple other universities, I think in Colorado and New Mexico or Arizona, on a project called SCAPES, which is doing research on agrovoltaics. So if you're interested in more on this topic, I'd encourage you to check out the SCAPES website. There is an outreach component of this project. They're very much in the research phase, and what they've, in conversations with them, they're doing a lot of the economic modeling to see how likely this will be. And something we've talked about is if the economics doesn't come out quite right, that's where like Prairie Rivers Network could come in to advocate for policies that incentivize that type of co-location, co-benefit for communities and farmers, and have policies that incentivize it if the budget doesn't quite come out right in their research. So check out that SCAPES project, and I'll let.
I was going to say that.
Okay.
But
All right.
Not as good.
And they do like I said, there's an outreach component. They do like regular calls that the public can get on and hear how the research is going. They created an app, agrivoltaic app for kids to create their own solar farm and add different crops to it and things. And that's really brand new. So I don't know which schools they're rolling it out in or anything, but exciting stuff. And I think, did you still have a question in the room?
Under the building climate resilience slide, there was a bullet about complete communities. Can you talk a little bit about what a complete community looks like?
So the question was on one of Trent's slides, there was a bullet point about complete communities, and she wants Trent to expand.
Is that on my slide? Did I talk about okay, sorry. That was under the other one. So complete communities is essentially there's a part of it called 15-minute communities. I don't know if that's makes sense or not, but essentially what it is that you have communities where all of your necessities are really close together, are compact. So you basically have a 15-minute bike or walk to everything that you would really need for day-to-day life, your grocery stores, your schools, your libraries, your fire departments, everything like that, municipal buildings. And so the idea is the design of and I say urban meaning developed area, because there's rural areas that are doing this as well. But the design of the developed areas such that it's not necessitating car-based transportation. One of the best examples, maybe in the country, is O'Fallon, Illinois, which is down by St. Louis, a pretty typical suburb as you would see it now. The town went whole hog into this idea of a 15-minute community. So the new development of the town is instead of being sprawl, it's these more compact and complete communities that are again not mandating. That's really important for some folks, probably not here, but some folks when we talk about this, but incentivizing non-car based transportation and movement. And it's a way of decreasing the amount of carbon. Yeah. So yeah. But check that out if you look up O'Fallon and 15 minutes, really cool stuff. Yeah.
All right. We're going to do another question. We've got about 5 minutes, so we'll do another question on Zoom. And if there's time, we'll do one more in the room. So this is from Jean Corti in Highland, Illinois. And you heard me in my presentation talk about how the Prairie State coal plant has a closure date under the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, but that closure date is in 2045. So most of our other coal plants have to close by 2030. But because of the complicated ownership structure of the Prairie State coal plant and the massive lobbying that went into it during the negotiations, that plant kind of got a carve out. It's a very complicated ownership structure where hundreds of municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives across 8 states own this coal plant. And they own it through cooperative agreements. And for many towns in Illinois, there's 32 Illinois towns that are part of the Illinois Municipal Electric Agency. And Jean lives in Highland, which is one of those IMEA communities. So her question is, these 32 IMEA Illinois towns have been asked to extend their coal contract and early, basically. And so she's struggling talking with her city council people about the alternatives to coal, and being told that there are not clean energy alternatives. So she asks if we have the technology and available to power 32 Illinois towns with renewable energy and storage. This is a solution they would need to be planned over the next decade and implemented by 2035. So I'll let Trent, if you have any thing to offer. I mean, I would say that yes, the technologies exist. Andrew and I have another blog post in the works that, we often hear from people, well, what happens when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow? Well, the conversation doesn't stop at renewable energy. We talked about energy efficiency. We need to actually reduce the amount of energy we use. Communities in the IMEA communities don't have a lot of energy efficiency programs. They're not part of Ameren, so they don't get to take advantage of those CEJA energy efficiency programs. So that's a big piece. We need to build a lot more transmission to move renewable energy around. So if the sun's not shining, or I guess rather if the wind's not blowing here, it might be blowing in Western Illinois. And if we have transmission lines to connect these variable resources, we need to increase what's called demand response, which is where we, during times of peak demand, like in the afternoon when people get home from work, there are programs through your utility where you can turn up your thermostat a few degrees at that time, reduce your usage when everybody's trying to use it. And there's all sorts of demand response opportunities that we haven't even explored yet. And all of this needs to be pieced together in long-term plans that, thanks to CEJA, Illinois has some of the most robust grid planning laws on the books in the country. So, the technologies do exist to get the IMEA communities powered by a portfolio of wind, solar, battery storage, increasing energy efficiency programs, et cetera. And I know that answer is not going to be sufficient to Jean. I know Jean well, and she would have been unhappy if I didn't ask her question, but she's smarter than I am on the issue. But I did want to let you all in the room know that the Prairie State Coal Plant is something that Prairie Rivers Network is actively working on. It's the largest emitter of greenhouse gas pollution in Illinois, and it's the 7th largest emitter of greenhouse gas pollution in the entire country. So the fact that we passed this nation-leading climate law, but we have this big polluter that's open till 2045 is something that we need to be working on. And Jean and others across the state are a big partner on that. We just brought on Anthony, my new energy coworker, who's going to be working in Southern Illinois with rural electric cooperatives that also have these long-term contracts with coal-fired power. We want to make sure they're not left behind in all this new opportunity. So I think we have like 40 seconds. If there's a quick question in the room. Well, go ahead and ask it. And there are some questions on Zoom we didn't get to. I will do my best to, in that follow-up materials to all of you, to answer some of the unasked questions. So go ahead, Carla, and we can. The CO2 pipelines. Andrew, do you want to answer this one? So the question in the room is, what is Prairie Rivers Network's thoughts on the CO2 pipelines proposed in Illinois? You want to come to the mic so the people on Zoom can. This is Andrew Rain, Director of Energy and Climate Policy at Prairie Rivers Network. And
hi, everybody. Amanda pulls me up for the tough question. There's a lot of problems with carbon pipelines that we don't have solved yet. And there's a lot of safety issues, a lot of community impacts. And so while we're looking at investing in carbon capture technology as a way to avert climate change, there's a lot of realities that we need to look really closely at before we just sort of march ahead and put a bunch of carbon capture on a bunch of ethanol plants, let them run into infinity, and let a bunch of coal and natural gas plants persist for long periods of time. When we don't know if they're actually going to capture all that carbon. We don't know how long it's going to be stored underground, and we don't know if we're trusting these companies to do it in a safe manner. To transport it over long distances. So CO2 is the big, CO2 capture is the big topic right now. There's a lot of ongoing negotiations going on in Springfield that our partners are a big part of, we're a big part of. And at 1 o'clock, I've got a call. So it'll come up in veto session, and it probably will also come up in spring about what we're going to do about that. And there's talk of a regulation, there's talk of a moratorium until the federal government figures their stuff out and can come up with some guidelines that are actually protective for the pipeline developers. But if you've heard of what happened in Satarsha, Mississippi, there's some real potential where a pipeline ruptured and communities were exposed to essentially a cloud of CO2 coming through, and people were unable to breathe. And Luckily, everybody survived, but emergency vehicles drive into a place like that, and our lovely combustion engines don't have any oxygen to combust, and so they stop operating. It's sort of a horrific thing to picture, of just like everything you have prepared no longer works because we just sort of assume that there's oxygen, which is a weird thing to assume on Earth. So yeah, I don't know. That's a long answer to that question, but thank you for asking, and thanks for pulling me up for the hard one, Amanda.
And Andrew did write a lovely newsletter article about the carbon capture gold rush in Illinois. And as he mentioned, so Illinois has a couple different legislative sessions. Our main one is in the spring, and it's like a 3 to 4 month period. We often do a lobby day where we take a bus and have a list of bills that we all work together to lobby our legislators on. And then he referred to veto session, which is like a 3 to 6 day period in the fall where the General Assembly will come back together. The governor might veto some bills. They have the opportunity to pass bills. So we might see this carbon capture, carbon pipeline legislation move in veto session. More likely it might spill over to the spring. So watch for more action alerts, more information, pick up a newsletter article on your way out, and you can read a little bit more about what Andrew said. So before I close, I did want to just acknowledge all my awesome coworkers in the room. I told my sons last night that I talk to people all the time. I usually don't get nervous, but the fact I was talking to my coworkers made me really nervous. And they were like, "That's so weird, Mom. Like you see them, you talk to them every day." But a lot of them know a lot more about these topics than I do. So I don't know if folks could stand up and wave so everyone knows who PRN staff is. Anthony, I already mentioned, started on Monday, as did Devin in the blue shirt. So welcome them to the PRM team. Giselle is a fellow with us, and she's been on for a couple weeks. You guys all know Sarah and Vicky in the back. Just met Andrew. Maggie, our fearless leader, and Jeff did all our technical support. So thanks to him getting the folks on Zoom in the room with us, even though they're not actually here. So round of applause for them. And then just once more to say thank you to Trent. Trent is the type of person that usually says yes. It's so awesome. Like we came up with this idea. I was like, I bet Trent will do this. And literally emailed me back like 30 seconds later. Yeah, that sounds like fun. So I love that about him, that he's willing to share his knowledge, and he has a lot of it. So we'll get you connected with Nina. We've got another 10, 15 minutes to refill your plates, your coffee, mingle a little bit. And thank you to all of you in the room for everything you've done to help pass the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, help fight pollution with Prairie Rivers Network. We look forward to working with you more. Thank you.